Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The Russians and the Americans have always been at odds when it comes to their respective policies when it comes to Syria. The Russians, as always, have argued that they were invited by the Syrian government, the government of Bashar al-Assad, that is, to enter into Syria and to help the government there fight against terrorists as well as a whole host of other militia groups. The Americans, as we know, are involved as well, especially in the north of the country. And now there has been a statement coming out of Moscow saying that, in fact, a Pentagon report that has accused Russia of hurting or violating the deconfliction process in Syria is, in fact, hypocritical and wrong, considering the fact that it is, in fact, the Americans that are in Syria illegally, at least in the Russian eyes, because they were not invited in by the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Taleb Ibrahim, who is an author, writer, and ex-deputy director of the Damascus Center for Strategic Studies. He's joining us today from Damascus. Joining us from New Haven, Connecticut this morning is Peter Rutland, who is a professor of government at Wesleyan University. Peter and Taleb, thank you both for taking our time out to join us today. Peter, let me start with you. This whole argument over who is authorized, in a sense, to be in Syria versus not. How important is that argument? Because that's really the basis of all of these back and forth accusations, aren't they?
Well, I'm not a specialist in international law, but as I understand it, the US government position is that the government of Syria is not a legitimate government and that there needs to be a new constitution with new elections supervised by the United Nations. So from a legal point of view, that's my understanding of the US position.
And so when it comes down to just simply the idea of the Russians hurting the peace process or any process in Syria versus the Americans' involvement in that country as well. Just to understand then, when it comes to peace overall, probably do you think that the Russians have the right intentions when it comes to that regard, considering Russian foreign policy in general?
Well, yeah, in the long term, I think Russia and the United States do have common interests, that they don't want to see killing continue. They don't want to see the spread of terrorism. So I think there are long-term convergence of interests by all of the outside powers to see Syria become a stable place that can start to rebuild. And the rebuilding will be very expensive and will require the cooperation of all of the countries of the region and beyond the region. So I think in the long term, there is a common interest. And in the short term, you mentioned the deconfliction measures that the various players who've intervened in that conflict have been trying to limit the possibilities of escalation and to keep their military operations separate from each other. And yeah, there are always some problems and challenges from both sides, but that seems to be working more often than not. So while the situation is very grim, I don't see anything that's really changed recently. That this has been going on for a long time, and unfortunately, the end is not in sight.
All right, so Taleb, from your vantage point there in Damascus, what do you make of the Russian argument that, in fact, it's the Americans who are illegally in Syria versus the American argument that it's, in fact, the Russians who are hurting the deconfliction process?
Very clear that Americans are occupying a large part of Syria, and no one called American to come or asked American to come to Syria for help. They said, we will help Syrian people, and they built illegal airports, illegal air bases, etc., etc. They are stealing the Syrian oil, Syrian corpses, etc., etc. And I don't think that we can compare between Russian presidents, which came under demand of the Syrian legitimized government, who is a part of the United Nations, and to fight the terrorism, while American came from themselves. Nobody asked the American to come, and I am sure that American presence in Syria is a problem to Syrians, all of Syrians, because not only they are occupying the large parts of Syria, they are working very closely to divide Syria for several parts to the eastern of Euphrates and western of Euphrates, and I think it will be a very good idea if America should be withdrawn without any war in Syria. Otherwise, that the American military presence in the eastern parts of Euphrates is a very important factor of destabilizing the situation in the whole Syrian territories.
Taleb, what do you make of the argument that Peter there correctly had pointed out that at some point the American and Russian interests do actually meet, right? They do agree on certain things when it comes to even Syria, such as the need to end the terrorism that erupted from there, specifically ISIS and other such groups. Is that something that possibly even the Syrian government could compromise on then with the Americans and Russians possibly even working together in the future on that in Syria?
They will work together while the American presence is classified as an occupation in the eyes of the Syrian citizens. And if you look at the situation in eastern Euphrates, many people are opposing the American military presence. They came only for the rescue of a very small minority of Syria for the Kurds, and they have other geopolitical goals. I don't think that America and Russia have a common interest in Syria at all. And I am not sure that Americans have real intentions to put an end to terrorism. They are using terrorism and they are using ISIS as a pretext or as an excuse to occupy those larger parts of Syria. The ex-American President Donald Trump said, what we need in Syria is oil. We went to Syria for oil. That means they didn't go to Syria to fight terrorism. And everybody in Syria knows that the main supporter to terrorism in Syria and in whole the region is the United States, especially the intelligence of the United States. And we have seen in the last days of the battle against ISIS in the Baghouz town in Deir Zor that American airplanes came and picked up a lot of the leaders of ISIS and took them to secret places at the Tanaf air base, which is another illegal military base in the Syrian-Iraqi borders.
Peter, what do you make of for whom this, i.e. Syria, is more important strategically, right? So for the Russians, we know that they've been making headways into the Middle East for a while now, right? Ever since the Americans have seemingly, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, have been walking back a little bit from the Middle East, especially in certain areas. Is this in some ways more important to the Russians than it is to the Americans to remain in Syria?
Well, yeah, the U.S. has been pulling back. President Trump wanted to withdraw all the American forces from Syria, but he was prevented from doing that. And the U.S. is right now withdrawing all its forces from Afghanistan. And so we have seen the U.S. really pull back from its presence in the region. And terrorism does remain a serious problem, and the United States is the number one target of ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorists. And Russia also is a prime target. It was a Russian plane with Russian tourists that was shot down by Al-Qaeda over Egypt in 2015. So terrorism does remain a serious problem. And so these countries, Russia's got plenty of oil. The United States has got plenty of oil. They don't need to be in Syria for oil. Their concern overwhelmingly is security. And to turn to your question, Russia sees its support for Syria as a diplomatic and military success. There's no question about that. It was risky for Russia to intervene because I think the Russian public would not want to see a lot of casualties of Russian soldiers coming back from Syria. But that hasn't happened. The Russian losses have been in the few hundreds. And so I think President Putin probably sees his role in Syria as quite successful. And as you say, putting Russia back into play in the Middle East as a broker. And its ability, hopefully, will be to bring different sides together, to bring Iran and Turkey together with the United States and the UN to try to stabilize the region.
What are your thoughts overall, I'm saying, about Russian involvement in Syria? Does Russia, do you think, have the ability to bring stability and peace to the country?
Yes, indeed, they have done, and they could make stability and peace in a very large parts of Syria. And Russia provided a lot of important humanitarian aid to many Syrians. And indeed, if we put the Russian military intervention in Syria aside, if we will say, what if Russia didn't intervene in Syria? I think that ISIS will be controlling the whole Syrian territories. Russia played a very instructive and a very important and decisive role in the war against terrorism in Syria and in the whole region.
Okay. So, if the Russians, Taleb, were to walk away from Syria at any point in time, would that be something that, have they left behind enough of a strong Syria for Syria to be able to carry itself forward? I mean, in the sense that for the Russians and the Americans, as Peter there have said, possibly security is an extremely important, aspect here. Can Syria ensure its own security, or does it completely now rely on the Russians?
Yes, and I think Syrian army is very strong, and they can ensure, and the Syrian government, after the defeating of ISIS and the other terrorist groups, and after rebuilding the Syrian army, I think everything should be okay, and I think Syrian army can secure all the Syrian territories.
Well, overall, then, Peter, when it comes to then working together, i.e. the Russians and the Americans, on places like Syria or even others around the world, so I'm thinking about places like Venezuela even, and possibly others that these two sides disagree on, is there a way, in fact, to have their positions brought closer together, or is this just how it's always been and always will be, where the Russian-American interests will diverge quite significantly around the world?
Well, Russian-American relations are at a low point right now. I mean, they have been much better in the past, and things really went downhill with the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, and so there's a long way to go yet. But I think overall, neither side needs conflict. Neither side benefits from conflict. The risks of war involving nuclear powers are extremely high. So I think hopefully both sides will find their way towards a dialogue on these issues of mutual concern, which is not just Syria, it's also the Iran, it's also the Ukraine. So there's lots of areas where they really do find some kind of common ground. Even though their interests are different, they do overlap in some areas.
As a final word, then, Peter, I'll stick with you. On then the issue of the American pullback from the Middle East, will this be a good thing in the sense that are the Americans prepared to have the Russians swoop in and sort of fill that vacuum which may be left behind? I mean, I would think that that would not be appreciated in Washington.
That's right. That's a good point. But after 20 years of conflict in the Middle East, the United States just doesn't want to invest more money and lives in the region. But Russia isn't the only other actor. Turkey is a very important player now. Gulf states, the Saudis, Israel. So it's a very complicated geopolitical map there, and Russia is joining a game, but it's not by any means the only player or the dominant player. Its role more, as I say, is a broker between these regional powers that have more at stake than Russia itself does.
We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Peter and Taleb for taking their time out to join us today here in Scope, and we're discussing their Russian-American involvement in Syria. The Russians say the American involvement is illegal. This coming after a Pentagon report, in fact, accused the Russians of violating the deconfliction process, which is meant to be taking place in Syria. Do both sides agree on security? As Peter there said, they probably do at some macro level. Nevertheless, when it comes down to the details, there probably is disagreement. Taleb there mentioned the fact that the Americans, or at least under Donald Trump, had mentioned that they were there for the natural resources of the country, specifically oil. But do the Americans actually need Syrian oil, which they can possibly get from elsewhere in the Middle East with much easier access than what they would have right now in Syria, with a lot less headache? At the same time, then, what does this also mean about Russian takeover, or lack of, if that's being overstated, of the Middle East? Does this mean that Russia will have more influence going forward in the Middle East, especially in these areas of unrest, such as Syria and other places as well that one can think of? That remains an open question, depending on how the American pullback occurs from the region. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the trip of Anthony Blinken to Ukraine, to Kiev, to show support for Ukraine in the face of what had been perceived as a Russian buildup of military right at the Ukrainian border. The Russians have now seemingly pulled back a lot of that military from the Ukraine border. Nevertheless, Blinken is in Ukraine to continue to show U.S. and NATO support for Ukraine at this point in time. We also have the fact that the Secretary of State will encourage progress in Ukraine's reform process to secure the Euro-Atlantic future. In an interview we've also had, the Ukraine's foreign minister said that there will be purchases also solidified during this trip of U.S. weapons, during this trip of Anthony Blinken, that is. Now, the Russians themselves have said that the West is annoyed that the truth about developments in Ukraine has in fact reached the United Nations. So the Russians have, as we know, accused the Ukrainians of not living by the Minsk agreement that was meant to bring peace into those regions under dispute, especially in East Ukraine. And we've also had the fact that the Russians' UN envoy has also slammed Western countries, i.e. the U.S., for not establishing dialogue over that and other issues pertaining to Ukraine and Russia tensions. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. I'm joined by Doctors Erik, Herron, Pavel, Luzin, and Michael Kimmage. Erik is an Eberly Family Distinguished Professor of Political Science at West Virginia University. He's joining us this morning from Morgantown, West Virginia. Pavel is a contributor of Jamestown Foundation and Riddle. He's joining us today from Perm in Russia. And Michael is a professor of history at Catholic University of America. He's also previously with the U.S. State Department in the policy planning staff members. He handled the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Michael, Pavel, and Erik, good afternoon and good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Pavel, let me start with you. In the Russian perspective, what does this Blinken trip to Ukraine mean at this time?
At this time, Russia is waiting, because after Biden's call to Vladimir Putin and after they agreed to make a meeting, to make a summit somewhere in Austria, maybe in June or later in summer. Russia preferred to wait, because Russia got everything it wanted to get from this escalation, this increasing military pressure on Ukraine.
Erik, what exactly is this trip meant to do, right? There's talk, yes, about weapon sales. Yes, there's talk about reforms, all of the above. But is this essentially just a sign of support? But at the same time, we know that though Ukraine has asked for membership into NATO, that's probably a long way off, isn't it?
Well, certainly. The NATO question is something for the future. But I think that the current visit, and Secretary Blinken characterized the problems that Ukraine face, I think, quite effectively in that visit. He said that Ukraine's facing aggression from without and within. And he characterized Russian annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass as external threats, and corruption in institutions and the behavior of oligarchs as the internal threat. And I think having the United States and having a high-level representative of the United States come to Kiev to reestablish relationships with politicians and the people of Ukraine, and to kind of alter the framing of United States-Ukrainian relations in the post-Trump era is a big part of this mission and an important part of the mission.
Michael, was this well-timed? I mean, obviously, I would think that the Russian military buildup close to the Ukraine border had a lot to do with this. Is that solely why Blinken is there right now to show support, even in the face of what was that military buildup?
I don't think it's solely why Secretary Blinken went at this particular moment. Of course, from his perspective, it's very necessary to signal that the United States won't be intimidated. It won't allow Russia to dictate the Ukraine policy of the United States, and so it's very much his right to visit at this moment and to signal strong support for Ukraine. But I think that there's one other issue at stake, which is that under President Trump, Ukraine policy became very politicized. President Trump was impeached for dealings that he had, alleged dealings that he had in Ukraine. And so I think what Secretary Blinken was also signaling to a degree to an American audience is that Ukraine is once again a foreign policy concern. It's not a domestic political football. And that's why it's very significant that the Secretary of State went as opposed to, say, a vice president or a president.
Pavel, how will this then be received in Moscow? I mean, if the Americans are going to be more involved, for example, in the Ukraine issue, that just adds more pressure on Russia. Will Russia then change its policy towards Ukraine?
I'm afraid no, because currently Moscow presumes that America, yes, will be involved more in Ukraine, but nevertheless, America will not establish, military bases in Ukraine. And because of Normandy format is dying, as well as Minsk agreements, they're dying, and Ukraine proposed to engage the United States into the negotiations, into the peaceful tradings, bargainings. So currently, Russia made its own step through this military pressure. Previously, in March and April, Russia got Biden's call. Vladimir Putin will meet with Joe Biden later this year. And so Russia, it seems Russia may get the initiative, the political initiative on its hands. So previously, Ukraine proposed to engage the United States into negotiations. Currently, Russia is doing this. Russia is engaging the United States into the negotiations. So Russia is trying to keep the political initiatives. So I think currently Russia is waiting, because this visit, Blinken's visit to Ukraine, didn't bring something significant to Russian policy towards Ukraine.
Okay, so Erik, what does a refocus, if I may use that term, of the Americans on Ukraine and that issue with Russia, what will that bring in the coming days? What will that bring during the Biden tenure? I mean, what will change possibly that was different under Trump?
President Biden was engaged with Ukraine back when he was vice president. He famously, in 2015, made a speech in front of the Verkhovna Rada speaking about the United States' support for Ukrainian sovereignty and for anti-corruption measures. And so Secretary Blinken's message is really a continuation of the kind of message that President or Vice President Biden at the time delivered to politicians in Kyiv. And I think that it just is a representation of how President Biden is going to return to that focus. And I think the other commentators have raised some important points about this entire issue that I think is worth discussing briefly, and that there's both a domestic and an international context for all of these decisions. So from the Russian perspective, the military buildup on the border not only shows force, but it came at a time when President Putin was about to make a national address. And in that national address, he indicated that there would be red lines that couldn't be crossed. And so that's a signaling mechanism for the international community. Domestically, he was dealing with the imprisonment and illness of Alexei Navalny, which was dominating the press cycle. And so when we think about how to interpret international actions or actions like the Russians took on the border with Ukraine, or the visit of Secretary Blinken to Ukraine. There's both an international and a domestic context that we should consider.
Indeed. Michael, if I may for a moment just bring in the very, very domestic context of Ukraine itself, right? And this has been brought up a number of times, at least by Russian experts that I've spoken to in the past also, that Ukraine has major issues with, for example, neo-Nazi parties, far-right parties, who are very xenophobic, etc., as well as issues of corruption. And I mean, there's a fairly long list of issues that exist on the Ukrainian side as well, even after the ouster of Yanukovych. Does that then signal that there will be limits to the American/NATO support for the country, even in the face of Russia?
I think absolutely. Nobody is more familiar with this problem set than President Biden, because, as already noted in this conversation, he worked intensively on this issue when he was vice president. I think, if anything, Secretary Blinken's language is probably a bit rosy. Ukraine has really struggled since the Maidan Revolution to deal with rule of law, to deal with corruption, to deal with the power of oligarchs. And indeed, there is, sort of boiling right-wing sentiment at the periphery of Ukrainian politics. But I think that what Secretary Blinken did was to gain leverage on that issue by signaling strong support for Ukraine, for its sovereignty, for its military. And that's very much what Ukraine wants, and so that will be a kind of bargaining chip in the next year or two about your reform, and will allow Washington really to pressure Ukraine to do more than they've been doing in the last couple of years.
Pavel, I wonder, on the Russian side, I know that even while Russia had that military buildup at the Ukraine border, Zelensky had in fact reached out to Moscow and the Kremlin and said we should meet, as in Zelensky and Putin should meet. Will that likely happen? I mean, I'm wondering from the Moscow point of view, from the Russian point of view, what kind of a relationship do they even want with Kiev at this time?
So it is not clear currently, because Putin proposed to meet with Zelensky in Moscow, but not to discuss Donbass. So 2 points that are unacceptable for Kiev, because Zelensky cannot go to Moscow, and Zelensky cannot avoid to discussing Donbass with Putin. So I think that means that Vladimir Putin doesn't want to meet with Zelensky, actually. And Vladimir Putin wants Zelensky, his administration, to fail into their efforts to make Ukraine less corrupted, to make Ukraine more successful in economics, in democratic development, and so on, so on. I think we will see some developments in this direction maybe later this year, after Putin-Biden summit. Not early.
Right. All right. So let's talk about that Putin-Biden summit, Erik. How important will that be whenever it does occur? And will these two be able to resolve issues, be it over Ukraine or a whole host of the other issues that they, of course, disagree on?
Well, if we think back to summits from the old Cold War era, there were often high expectations and low levels of delivery on outcomes. And so I think that we have to be careful about what we expect a summit to deliver. Simply reestablishing relationships between Moscow and Washington, trying to find some areas for collaborative work. And that will, in fact, be challenging, but trying to find some areas of collaboration and to come out of a summit with a recognition that there are many areas of disagreement, and Ukraine will be one of those areas. But some areas in perhaps trade and commerce, perhaps efforts on climate, where Moscow and Washington share goals and can develop some kind of collaboration would be, I think, successful. But I wouldn't anticipate any kind of major accomplishments from a summit. I think that having the summit itself is an important development and signal.
What are your thoughts about what a summit may bring? I mean, under the Trump tenure, we know that there was a lot of talk about his connection with Russia, right? So beyond just the issue of Russian collusion, there was also just his relationship, at least behind the scenes as well, with Putin. Will this time be very different, and what will be different?
Time will be very different. There was one summit of a kind between Trump and Putin, and that was, for many American observers, absolutely disastrous. It was in Helsinki, and Trump seemed to be siding with Putin over over the American government. So that's not going to happen with a President Biden. We could back up for a moment and say one of the first important things to occur between the U.S. and Russia after Biden came into office in mid-January was the signing of the New START agreement and the extension of arms control. So there already has been a bit of diplomacy negotiation between these two countries. If you look carefully at the statements of the Biden administration, one of the words that recurs when they speak about U.S.-Russian relations is stability. So that's what I think they're going to be trying to accomplish. Of course, there's no mid-level diplomatic contact, so there's no, I think, preparation for any kind of big breakthrough or anything like that. So, I think it's clear that that won't occur with the summit. But the best that actually both heads of state could do, if they really do meet in June, is simply to normalize the meeting itself, and then hope that in the future they can accomplish a few things with that channel.
Pavel, I wonder from the Russian side as well, what are the Russians hoping to achieve from a summit, right? Like during the Trump tenure, as I said, there was a lot of pressure on him as president and his relationship with Putin, and he was really under the spotlight for that throughout his tenure. Will this be different? Are the Russians hoping that things will actually be better this time around, or do they foresee that things will be worse?
I think we shouldn't speak in terms of better or worse. Russia wants to discuss a lot of topics with the United States. Firstly, arms control topic, because Russia wants to include American missile defense into the arms control regime, space security, and so on and so on. And of course, Russia-American tensions in Ukraine, in Syria, even in Libya, and many other security issues. Russia currently doesn't hope that, unlike with Trump era, currently Russia doesn't hope that Russia may bargain with the United States, may break this isolation, make lift off all the sanctions. No. Currently, Russia just wants to start the discussion towards many security topics, to play the role of great power again, because even this Blinken's visit to Ukraine was very painful to Russia, because currently, May 2021, Blinken didn't find the time to meet with Lavrov, for instance, or with Putin, for instance. Yes, it's very painful for Russian image, for Russian reputation, and currently Russia wants to restore its reputation as a great power, and so on and so on.
That's very Erik, I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. On that point that Pavel there was making about security cooperation, that's of course been something that everyone around the world has been watching with bated breath, right? When it comes to nuclear arms treaties, etc. The two countries are still, very, very important powers in that regard. Will they cooperate on those issues beyond, of course, their disagreements on various other aspects?
I think there are incentives for both to cooperate on reducing nuclear weapons. There are some incentives for them to cooperate, has been mentioned, on space and the militarization of space. And so I think there's this potential for there to be some kind of beginning to an agreement on these issues and arms control. So once again, I wouldn't anticipate out of June any kind of major development. I would be happy to be surprised by that, as I'm sure the other panelists would as well. But as was said, this is going to be about normalizing relations or reestablishing relations. And arms control is certainly an area where we could see future developments as this relationship matures over time.
Very well. We'll leave it there. I really appreciate all three of our guests, Erik, Pavel, and Michael, for taking their time out to discuss Russia-U.S. relations in the context of Ukraine. We were discussing at this time the Blinken visit, the Secretary Blinken visit to Ukraine, right as the Russians have pulled back from the Ukrainian border, a signal of support to Ukraine, a signal that Ukraine is once again one of the priorities for this American administration, that is under President Biden. Under Donald Trump, there was seemingly a bit of a step back from the region, in some people's eyes at least, in Washington, D.C. What does this mean, though, for the future of Russia-U.S. relations overall, Russia, even NATO relations? The Russians have always complained about NATO expansionism, saying that NATO is simply too close to its borders, always trying to control it and or, contain it in some ways. The sanctions also, serve the same purpose. But there are huge issues around the world on which we need the cooperation of these two powers, be it nuclear weapons or many, many other issues, many other war zones, in fact, even in the Middle East, unrest in Venezuela, etc., also on the horizon. So cooperation is important, and let's see if that summit, whenever it does happen, is able to produce any fruitful results for both sides. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.